From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story comes to an end. Chapter 50. Fraenk spent the next 2 weeks recuperating in his reserved bed in the healer's ward of Mersey's temple. There was no parade in his honour, and even the thanks he got was muted. More often, what he received instead were questions of why that were neutral in tone at first, but became more accusatory, as if Fraenk was somehow responsible for all the calamity. Then after that inquisition ebbed, they were replaced by annoying faces with buzzing questions that only the Arch-Preceptor seemed to be able to answer. He finally escaped one night and stole away to Valthor's lighthouse. And even though he'd left a note that he was well and not to send guards to scour every corner of the district for him, he only managed to make it 3 days before they did exactly that. But by then, he felt well enough to return to his tower in Blackroot Estate anyway, and so without much fanfare, Arch-Preceptor Fraenk Neversleep was back on the job. Very much to her credit, Kyla had found him in the immediate aftermath of the attack and staunched the bleeding in his back until he could be seen to by the healers, effectively saving his life. She even came to visit him a few times while he recovered. They were late evening visits, after the bustle of the day had calmed, and when they had the least amount of interruption. They drank tea, and sometimes stronger stuff, while munching on small cakes and confections from a pastry shop she had found in the upper market. They talked a lot about what they both had been through. Kyla insisted upon hearing the full account of Farathiel Gingerglade getting halved by the High Lord. The joy she took in hearing it bordered on the pathological, but considering what he'd put her through, Fraenk figured she had earned the right to hear its telling as many times as she liked. It was during her last visit, after a stray vanilla butter biscuit had fallen from their tray, and she leaned forward to recover it, that Fraenk was not surprised to see the chain of the decoy necklace peek out from her collar. He brought up the mind thief later in the course of their conversation, about how his preceptors discovered it was unaccounted for, and how the partisan and arcane lords were still trying to recover it. Kyla surmised the possibility where someone had picked it up in the chaotic aftermath, and probably found it so uninteresting that they threw it in an old trunk, where it would live out the rest of its days. Fraenk made a show of vowing to doggedly track it down someday when he had recovered. The Inez Tylerborn was too dangerous to be floating around the world unguarded, and Kyla promised her aid in its recovery as well. Whether or not she knew the one she carried was a fake, she made no indication, and of course Fraenk already knew exactly where the authentic one was, in a leather pouch he kept around his own neck. In a quiet moment at night, he had tried to put it on and summon the necklace's power, but whatever Dandrekan had done to it seemed to have depleted the item's magic. Now it was just an ugly, cracked stone on a pitted old chain. Fraenk kept it so he could be confident that it would never come to misuse again. It was a small burden to have to carry forever, but didn't everyone have something like it? Fraenk wanted to say more to her, but he could never find the moment. They always seemed to be in middle of a side-splitting laugh about Doran Leafwater with his head stuck in the mouth of the Shadescourge, or in the silence when their eyes met while both taking a sip of tea, creating some feeling he could not put into words. He wasn't even sure what he would say, or if there were even words created to express the mix of thoughts which he held for her. There were times when it looked as though she was about to say something to him as well, but her eyes veered off and Kyla would mention the delicious flavour of the cake, or how the city was overdue for rain. Their moment never seemed to happen. Even though she said she was going to stay in Arathes, it would be some while before he saw Kyla again, at least until the incident with the cursed statue. But the account of that tale is written in another scroll. Fraenk Neversleep sat on the stone bench in the garden of Blackroot Estate. Much like he had been when he was first summoned to the scene where his friend Mycon had been killed. It felt like an impossibly long time ago, and in other ways, like the freshness of his grief, like not much time at all. The afternoon sun dappled the waters of the ancestral pool. He had decided to be done staring at walls with their faded etchings of the past. No good ever came from staying embittered to history. What was done long ago could not be changed. Letting it fester inside would only destroy you, like it did to his friend Leos. Fraenk found himself thinking a lot about his friend, wishing he could have made a peace with the man sooner. And when he started feeling too melancholy, Fraenk would visit him at the tomb he'd commissioned far beyond the city walls. Leos always liked to sleep outside. The incident in the upper city was overshadowed by the monster on the docks. The new arch-partisan was a much younger elf and a returned military hero, who was just as humorless as his predecessor, and although he was verified as unaffiliated by the Elder Council, Fraenk's preceptors uncovered certain familial connections which tied back to the Fernbrooks. Fraenk was not surprised to hear that the investigation into Lord Fernbrook's attempted coup had stalled out entirely. He knew the day was coming when Fernbrook might try again, but it would not be soon. Elves were devilishly patient when they wanted to be, and Fernbrook could wait until long after Fraenk was dead. The Leviathan's attack on the dock turned out to be something of a hidden blessing for the port of Arathis and for House Blackroot in particular. The aging docks and warehouses that previously were beginning to rot on their posts were now being constructed, along with a redesign of the entire harbour, which had more piers, warehouses, cranes and berths for ships. The entire operation was heavily invested by all the high houses, including Lord Whiteleaf himself. And when word filtered back to Pylius about how one of their prized galleons had defeated a Leviathan in naval combat, they moved with surprising haste to find the gold required to finish the ship's overhaul so they could bring the ship home. Political stunt or no, the Acheron of Ports was more than happy to get the galleon out of his docks and turned back toward home. Fraenk heard a foot scuff gravel and was expecting to see Nym Stonebridge. His underling had healed quickly and seemed to not bear any ill feelings about his kidnapping and torture. He was downright chipper most days, proclaiming to all who would listen about how his fortunes had changed. Although most attributed this newfound joy to his brush with near death, Fraenk suspected it had more to do with his almost unbeatable run at the dice tables, which Fraenk himself had secretly secured for him with the dealers on Canal Street. When Fraenk looked up, he was surprised to see Lady Blackroot being helped along the path by her handmaids. She cursed and swatted at them as they fussed over her, unperturbed by her mild abuse.
"May I join you, Neversleep?"
Lady Blackroot asked when she saw him watching her. "It is your garden, my lady." Fraenk slid to one side on the bench to allow space for her.
"Good. It took a lot of effort to get out here, and I'm not about to turn around now."
Her handmaids required several more minutes to get the old elf situated on the bench and get her dress draped in a pleasing way until Lady Blackroot finally had to threaten them with a horsewhipping to send them scampering off.
"Who skarking cares what my dress looks like? It's just us out here."
"As you say, my lady," Fraenk chuckled. "I think they just care about you." She watched him for a moment out of the corner of her eye. "How is your friend's health these days?"
"He's finding retirement suits him well enough. He frequently tells me how pleased he is not to be cleaning up after another one of your messes. I wish I had that luxury."
"Give Lord Brightrock my regards and tell him I'm pleased to pay him a visit." Lady Blackroot snorted out a laugh. Fraenk couldn't help but laugh too.
"We've been through much, haven't we, Fraenk?"
she said wistfully. "That we have."
"Many have tried to kill us. The Fernbrooks, and before that, the Redthorns who nearly succeeded."
"Yes, I'm quite familiar with all of that." Fraenk smirked and touched the scar on his face.
"I got a letter today from my son. He will be home soon. Along with the main host of Arathis' army, I sent him off to war in order to see him grow into a man. I'm afraid he has become something much worse. We have many challenging days ahead, Archpreceptor."
I'm by your side until the end, my lady, Fraenk said.
Mine will be coming sooner than yours, I fear.
Fraenk started to protest, but she quickly cut him off.
Stop! I don't keep you around to lie to me, Neversleep.
She looked directly into his eyes.
I will require your solemn oath that you'll watch over him when I'm gone. He is now my surviving heir, and I worry greatly for him. He will need good people to guide him. Blackroot still has many enemies.
Fraenk was a churning mix of emotions, but Lady Blackroot always spoke plain with him, and her concern was evident. She would not relax until she wrung the promise from him. I will, my lady. Neversleep vowed, and immediately felt an icy chill across his chest. And for a moment Fraenk felt like he could read the old woman's mind. It was fear. For her son or fear of him, he wasn't sure. Without thinking, Fraenk touched the leather pouch on his neck. It was cold to the touch and hard, but quickly unthawing. Frank's heart began to pound. Lady Blackroot looked down at her reflection in the ancestral pool, then sighed and grew very still.
Do you know why we elves have these put into our gardens, Fraenk? Other than the fact that they're outrageously expensive and a pain in the kiv to upkeep?
It's where you dispose of meddlesome handmaidens, Fraenk said, deadpan. Lady Blackroot barked a laugh. Then her expression got serious.
We have a saying. Well, we have many buildings full of sayings, but one in particular that goes, if you forget your father's face, you will repeat his sins. These pools are to connect us to those we have lost, though we love them, to remind us not to make their same mistakes.
Fraenk could remember his father's face, at least the last one he wore, the terrible one with the upturned snout and glowing eyes. But he had one before that. There was a man underneath the monster, a troubled, broken man, one that meant well but lived too far in his cups to help the people he cared about. Was Fraenk repeating the same mistakes? He had no answer. Fraenk was surprised when she took his hand suddenly.
I have an idea. Permit me one request, Fraenk.
She said,
I need to see into your past.
Fraenk tensed and almost stood. What? Why? He asked more angrily than he had intended. She had no business there.
I wish to name you as Lord of Blackroot instead,
she said. There was no mirth in her tone nor expression. You have a rightful heir, Fraenk replied. I'm sure Aerlith would object.
And it is for his very sake that I ask. Fraenk, only you know what it takes to keep Blackroot district strong. He cares for nothing but plays, poetry, and the skirts of maidens.
Fraenk looked up nervously. The estate's guards were fairly distant, but if they overheard her, it could make his life very difficult. Some would judge even this conversation as treason and Fraenk as a rounder usurper. Perhaps war has changed him, my lady. He may come home a valiant commander.
War seldom returns better versions of men, and the only battle he saw was from a distant hill.
Lady Aris growled.
My mind is made, Neversleep. I want you to oversee the district as Lord Governant until you feel that Aerlith is ready. It will be up to you to make sure he's prepared.
Even if I agreed, no elf in this city would allow it. Fraenk scoffed derisively, then ran a finger along the curve of his ear.
If I could find even the most distant elf in your lineage, that would change everything.
Well done, my lady. Fraenk laughed with relief. You're having a jest at me for all the trouble I put you through. I deserve that. Frank's smile faltered when he saw her stony expression.
For the sake of my husband, Lord Tainer Blackroot, and our family line going back to the Second Age. Please, Fraenk.
Lady Blackroot begged. Fraenk saw how thin and frail she looked.
We only need one ancestor, and I can name you by law. Please.
Fraenk still hesitated. He could see many ways this could go very poorly for him, even if she found an elf somewhere in his past, which itself seemed highly unlikely. He had no wish to deny his patron, however. The woman had lifted him up in so many instances, why not let her try one last time?
Come on, I shouldn't think I would have to beg someone to become the most powerful human in Arathis.
Finally, and with great reluctance, Fraenk nodded.
Lean forward and let me look.
Lady Blackroot hooked her small skeletal hand in his arm, and they peered together into the ancestral pool. She began whispering something in Elvish that Fraenk didn't understand. As if in response, a slight breeze picked up, tossing the flaps and folds of their clothing, but instead of the water growing more choppy, it turned mirror still. For a long time she gazed. Fraenk only saw the reflected sky and their own images. Then finally she grew very still. Questions buzzed in his head, but he waited for her to speak. The silence drew out longer, and Fraenk began to wonder if she had somehow fallen asleep. But then finally she spoke.
My son Aerlith shall succeed me as Lord of Blackroot.
The hope Fraenk didn't realize he had been holding on to collapsed like a warehouse being smashed by a leviathan. A twinge of bitterness twisted in his mind, but he forced it back. Lady Blackroot had already given him more than any human could ask, and he would be grateful for it all. "I will serve him as well as I serve you, my lady," Fraenk said.
Then he'll certainly have his work cut out for him.
She smiled wearily.
Come, help me up and let's go have a drink.
"A splendid notion, my lady," Fraenk said, taking her arm. Fraenk helped Lady Blackroot back to standing. A fresh breeze moved through the estate garden, carrying the sounds of leaves, water, and the songs of birds. A rare and elusive feeling of tranquility came over him. For as long as it would last, he was determined to enjoy it.
Fraenk, I'm sorry for your parents. I had no idea.
She said as he led her up along the gravel walkway.
And your dear sister.
Yes, I lost them all when I was very young. Fraenk Neversleep looked over at his lady, who bore a puzzled expression.
But that's not true. I just saw her in the waters, Fraenk. She's alive.
The end.
Epilogue. Winston the Nether Demon found himself back where he belonged in the dimension of eternal non-existence. It was not a bad place to live, but being a location outside of time and space made it somewhat difficult to receive correspondence. Nevertheless, it was good to be home. He was surprised to note that he had something of a headache, which was a novelty, and found himself rather enjoying it. It wasn't often that he experienced anything but ennui or hunger, and perhaps an occasional mild interest in pottery. But it didn't explain how he seemed to be unable to account for exactly what had happened from the time he was splashing along the shoreline in a lovely human world to this moment now when he was back in the Netherrealm. Mortals were indeed a tricky lot. Perhaps they were more than just tasty souls to devour. For now, all he wanted was a nice hot cup of jasmine tea, which was a comfort in any dimension, and a few biscuits laced with the undying screams of the eternally anguished. He curled up in a blanket of sorrow and kicked his feet up in front of the flames of torment. As far as relaxation went, this was the furthest thing from it, and exactly how Winston liked to spend his eternity. As he basked in the glow of cosy, swirling madness, an odd thought occurred to him. Perhaps in another time that was a very long, or perhaps incredibly short span from now. It was hard to determine such things in the non-existence. When they foolishly summoned him to once again run rampage in their terrible world, Winston thought he may spend just a bit of time getting to know them. Learn what makes them tick, to borrow their odd expression, perhaps discover their hopes, desires and dreams, and also fears, yes, tasty, tasty fears. Summon me again, foolish mortals, he thought. You'll find me in the arcane scrolls under the name Boltzoan.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. More titles from the realm of Galhadria can be found at blacksteelpress.com. We thank you for supporting independent voices in fantasy fiction. Original theme music was composed and performed by Rowan the Bard. The Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, will be available in hardcover and paperback, coming soon. Once again, we thank you for listening.